The sky burned orange and red as another explosion lit up the horizon, and Sergeant Marcus Cole pressed his back against the crumbling wall and tried to catch his breath. 11 years of war had turned him into something hard and cold and efficient. But today was different, because today the Dominion forces had broken through the defensive lines, and everything had fallen apart. His squad was gone, and he did not know if they were dead or simply lost in the chaos. But he knew that staying in one place meant death, so he kept moving through the ruins of what had once been a beautiful city. Vethkara had been a peaceful world before the war came, and now it was nothing but rubble and fire. And the screams of the dying Marcus was 34 years old, and he had been fighting since he was 23, and sometimes he forgot what peace even looked like, but he never forgot how to survive. Because survival was the only thing he was good at. He moved through the shadows like a ghost, and his rifle was ready, and his eyes scanned every corner for threats. The Dominion hunter drones were everywhere, and their red sensors swept through the darkness, looking for Coalition soldiers to kill, and Marcus had already destroyed 2 of them, but he knew more were coming. He found shelter in what looked like an old government building, and the walls were thick enough to block the drone sensors, so he slipped inside and allowed himself a moment to rest. The building was dark and quiet and filled with dust and debris, and Marcus moved carefully through the hallways, looking for a safe place to wait out the night. That was when he heard a small sound like a whimper or a cry, and it came from somewhere deeper in the building. Marcus froze and listened, and the sound came again, and it was definitely a child crying. He should have ignored it, because he was alone and injured and running low on ammunition, and stopping for anything was dangerous, but something in that sound pulled at him, and he could not walk away. He followed the crying through the ruined hallways and past the bodies of soldiers wearing uniforms he did not recognize, and finally he found Hirsch was small, and her skin glowed with a soft blue light that pulsed with her heartbeat, and her eyes were large and silver and filled with tears, and she was trapped under a fallen beam with rubble piled around her. Marcus knew what she was immediately, because everyone in the coalition knew about the Altharithi were the oldest and most powerful race in the coalition, and they ruled from their crystal throne world, and their queen had lived for thousands of years, and they were beings of light and wisdom and power. But this one was just a child, and she was scared and hurt, and alone around her lay the bodies of 6 Althari guards in ceremonial armor, and Marcus understood that this had been some kind of secret hiding place, and the Dominion had found it and killed everyone except the little girl. She looked up at him with those silver eyes, and she said something in a language he did not understand, but the fear in her voice needed no translation. Marcus put down his rifle and knelt beside her, and he spoke softly, even though she could not understand his words. "Hey there, little one," he said. "I'm going to help you, okay? So just stay calm and let me get you out of here." He worked quickly to move the rubble away from her, and the beam was heavy, but he was strong and determined, and after several minutes of struggle, he managed to lift it enough for her to crawl free. She was hurt, and her leg was cut, and she was shaking with fear, but she was alive. Marcus pulled out his medical kit and bandaged her wound, and the whole time she watched him with those huge silver eyes, like she was trying to understand what he was. His communicator crackled with static, and then a cold mechanical voice spoke, and Marcus felt his blood run cold. Dominion hunter drones had detected the Althari biosignature, and they were coming. Marcus looked at the little girl, and he thought about his options. Could leave her and slip away into the night and probably survive, because he was fast and quiet and good at staying hidden, or he could take her with him and slow himself down and probably die trying to protect an alien child he had never met before. It was not really a choice at all. He picked her up, and she was lighter than he expected, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, and her glow dimmed until she was almost dark. "Smart girl," Marcus whispered, and he realized She could hide her light when she was scared, and that would help them survive. He moved through the building and out into the night with the child on his back, and the drones were getting closer, and he could hear their engines humming in the darkness. Marcus had been a soldier for 11 years, and he had done terrible things and seen terrible things, and sometimes he wondered if there was anything good left inside him. But carrying this small, frightened child through the ruins of a burning city, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like he mattered. The first drone found them near the edge of the city, and Marcus shot it out of the sky with 3 precise rounds, and the explosion lit up the night. The little girl whimpered and held on tighter, and Marcus kept running. He did not know where the coalition lines were, and he did not know if anyone would help them. And he did not know if they would survive the night, but he knew that he would not stop running until she was safe. He had been alone his whole life, and he had never had anyone to protect, and he had never thought he wanted anyone to protect. But this child had looked at him with trust in her silver eyes, and that trust was worth more than his own. Life show Sergeant Marcus Cole ran into the darkness with an alien princess on his back, and the sound of drones behind him, and he did not look back. The war had taken everything from him, but it had not taken his humanity, and tonight that humanity would be enough. It had to be enough. 3 days felt like 3 years, when every shadow could hide an enemy, and every sound could mean death. Marcus moved through the occupied territory with the little Althary girl on his back, and he learned quickly that she was braver than most soldiers he had known. She did not cry even when she was hungry, and she did not complain even when the rain soaked them both, and she did not make a sound when the enemy patrols passed close enough to touch. On the first day, Marcus learned her name. She pointed at herself and said, "Lyrae," and then she pointed at him with a question in her silver eyes. "Marcus," he said, and she tried to repeat it, but it came out as Marcus, and that made him smile for the first time in months. They could not speak each other's language, but they found other ways to communicate. She would tug his ear when she heard something dangerous, and he would tap her shoulder twice when it was safe to move, and they developed a silent language of gestures and looks that kept them alive. The Dominion forces were everywhere, and the city was full of patrols and checkpoints and hunter drones that never stopped searching. Marcus had to kill 4 soldiers on the first day, and he made sure to cover Lyrae's eyes before he did it, because she did not need to see what he was capable of doing. He found shelter for them in an abandoned basement, and they shared his ration bars, and she made a face at the taste, but she ate anyway because she was hungry and smart enough to know that food was food. That night she could not sleep because she was scared and cold, so Marcus held her in his arms and hummed an old song his mother used to sing before she died, and Larry fell asleep with her head on his chest. Did not sleep at all because someone had to keep watch. On the second day, things got worse. The Dominion had figured out that something valuable had escaped from the compound, and they flooded the area with soldiers and drones, and Marcus had to change direction 3 times to avoid capture. He was running low on ammunition, and his body was tired, and his wounds from the initial battle were starting to hurt, but he could not stop, because stopping meant death for both of them. Lyrae seemed to understand that he was struggling, because she started walking on her own when the ground was flat, and she only asked to be carried when they had to move fast. She was 8 years old by Althary counting, which Marcus guessed was something like 6 or 7 in human years, and she was handling this nightmare better than many adults would have. He killed 7 more soldiers on the second day, and each time he felt a piece of himself grow colder, but he did not let it show because Lyrae was watching and she needed him to be strong. That night they hid in the ruins of a temple, and Lyrae found a small flower growing through the cracks in the floor, and she picked it and gave it to Marcus with a shy smile. He tucked it into his vest pocket and thanked her, and she did not understand his words, but she understood his meaning. On the third day, they reached the river. The coalition lines were somewhere on the other side, but the bridges were all destroyed or guarded, and the only way across was through the old drainage tunnels that ran under the city. The tunnels were flooded with cold, dark water, and Marcus knew that going through them would be dangerous, but staying above ground was more dangerous, so he had no choice. He explained to Lyrae what they were going to do using gestures and pointing, and she looked at the dark water with fear in her eyes, but she nodded and held onto him tighter. The water was freezing, and it came up to his chest, and he had to hold Lyrae above his head to keep her from going under. She was shivering and scared, but she stayed quiet, and her light dimmed to almost nothing, and she trusted him completely. Halfway through the tunnel, Marcus heard voices behind them, and he knew the enemy had found their trail. He moved faster, and the water got deeper and colder, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he did not stop. The exit was blocked by debris, and Marcus had to put Lyrae on a narrow ledge while he cleared the way with his bare hands, and the rocks tore his skin, and the cold made his fingers numb, but he kept working behind them. The voices were getting closer, and flashlights swept through the darkness. Marcus finally cleared enough space for them to squeeze through, and he grabbed Lyrae and pushed her ahead of him, and they emerged into the night air on the other side of the river. But they were not safe yet, because the cold had gotten into his bones and his body was shutting down, and he could barely walk. He carried Lyrae for another hour through the mud and the rain, and his vision was blurring, and his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She was crying now and saying his name over and over, Marcus, Marcus, and patting his face with her small hands trying to keep him awake. Marcus saw lights ahead, and he heard voices speaking Coalition Standard, and he knew they had made it. He walked toward the lights, and soldiers rushed forward with weapons raised, and he held up Lyrae so they could see her, and he said the only words he had strength left to speak. She is Princess Lyrae of the Althari royal house, and she needs help. Then his body gave out and he fell to his knees, but even as he collapsed, he kept his arms raised to hold her. Above the mud, the last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Lyrae being lifted gently from his hands by soldiers, who suddenly understood what they were looking at. The last thing he felt was her small hand touching his face one more time. Then there was nothing but silence and cold and the peaceful darkness of unconsciousness. He had done what he set out to do, and she was safe, and that was all that mattered. Marcus woke up in a room made of light. The walls seemed to glow from within, and everything was white and silver and gold, and he had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. He sat up slowly and realized that nothing hurt anymore. His wounds were gone, and the cuts on his hands from the tunnel had healed, and even the old scar on his shoulder from a battle 5 years ago had disappeared. He looked down at his body, and he was clean and dressed in soft clothes that felt like water against his skin, and he had no idea where he was or how long he had been unconscious. A door opened, and an Althari woman entered, and she was tall and graceful with skin that glowed soft gold, and she smiled at him with warmth in her silver eyes. "You are awake," she said in perfect Coalition Standard. "That is good, because there are many who have been waiting to see you." Marcus tried to stand, but his head was spinning, and the woman gently pushed him back down. "Rest for a moment," she said. "Your body has been healed, but it needs time to adjust to the changes we have made." "Where am I?" Marcus asked, and his voice was rough from disuse. "You are on the throne world of the Althari Empire." The woman said, "You have been asleep for 12 days while we repaired the damage the war did to your body." Marcus stared at her in disbelief, because the throne world was legendary, and humans were almost never allowed to visit. And he was just a soldier with no rank or importance. "Why?" he asked. The woman smiled again, and her glow brightened slightly. "Because you saved Princess Lyrae," she said, "and Queen Sireth wishes to thank you personally." Marcus felt his stomach drop, because the Queen of the Althari was one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and she had ruled for over 4,000 years, and the idea of meeting her was terrifying. "I was just doing my job," he said. The woman laughed softly and shook her head. No, Sergeant Cole, you are not doing your job at all. And that is precisely why you are here. She helped him stand and led him through hallways that seemed to be made of crystal and light. And everywhere he looked, there were Althari watching him with curiosity and something that might have been respect. They reached a set of massive doors that rose higher than any building Marcus had ever seen, and the woman stopped. Beyond these doors is the throne chamber, she said. The queen and her court are waiting for you, and I want you to understand something before you enter. Marcus looked at her and waited. In 4,000 years of rule, Queen Sirith has never personally received a human in her throne room, and what is about to happen has not been done for any outsider in over 12,000 years, so please try not to faint. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the doors began to open. The throne chamber was impossible. It was a vast space filled with floating platforms of crystal and light, and thousands of Althari stood on these platforms watching as Marcus walked forward on a bridge that seemed to be made of solid starlight. At the end of the bridge was a throne carved from a single massive crystal that pulsed with inner fire. And sitting on that throne was the most beautiful and terrifying being Marcus had ever seen. Queen Sirith was tall even by Althari standards, and her skin glowed with a light that shifted through every color of the rainbow, and her eyes were like pools of liquid silver, and her presence filled the entire chamber with a weight that made it hard to breathe. Marcus stopped at the base of the throne, and he did not know what to do, so he did what any soldier would do, and he stood at attention and saluted. A murmur ran through the assembled court, and Marcus wondered if he had done something wrong. Then the queen did something that made the entire court gasp in shock. She rose from her throne and descended the steps until she was standing at his level, and she looked at him with those ancient silver eyes, and Marcus felt like she was seeing everything he had ever done, or thought, or felt. Sergeant Marcus Cole, she said, and her voice was like music. Do you know why you're here? To be thanked for saving your daughter, Your Majesty, Marcus said, and he was amazed that his voice did not shake. No, the queen said, you are here because you did something that my people have forgotten how to do. She turned to address the court, and her voice carried to every corner of the vast chamber. This human had no obligation to my child, and no treaty compelled him to act, and no reward was promised for his service. Yet when he found her alone and afraid, he did not hesitate. She turned back to Marcus, and her glow intensified. He carried her through fire and darkness and cold, and when his body failed him, he still held her above the water, so she would not drown, and he asked for nothing in return. She was scared, Marcus said simply. She needed help, and that was all there was to it. The court fell completely silent, and in that silence, Marcus heard a familiar voice cry out his name, Marcus. He turned and saw Lyra running toward him across the bridge of light, and she was healthy and happy, and her glow was bright and strong, and she launched herself at him with such force that he nearly fell over. He caught her and held her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and chattered happily in her own language, and Marcus felt tears burning in his eyes. The queen watched them with an expression that Marcus could not read. My daughter has not stopped talking about you since she woke, she said. She calls you her guardian and her protector and her friend, and she has asked every day when you would wake up. Marcus looked at the little girl in his arms, and she smiled at him with pure joy. I am glad she is safe, he said. That is all I wanted. The queen nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I believe that is true, and that truth is why you are here. She reached out and touched his face gently, and her fingers were warm and soft. We have much to discuss, Sergeant Cole, about your future and about a debt that cannot be repaid with simple rewards. Marcus did not understand what she meant, but he had a feeling. His life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The queen led Marcus to a private chamber away from the watching eyes of the court, and Larry refused to let go of his hand, so she came. The chamber was smaller than the throne room, but still larger than any building Marcus had ever been inside. And the walls showed images of stars and galaxies that seemed to move and breathe. Queen Sareth sat on a simple chair and gestured for Marcus to sit across from her, and Larry climbed into his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Tell me about yourself, Sergeant Cole," the Queen said. Marcus shrugged, because there was not much to tell. I'm an orphan," he said. "My parents died when I was 7, and I grew up in military schools because there was nowhere else for me to go. And when I was old enough, I joined the coalition forces, because fighting was the only thing I knew how to do." "No family?" the Queen asked. "No wife or children waiting for you to return?" "No, Your Majesty," Marcus said. "I never had time for that kind of thing. And honestly, I never thought I would live long enough for it to matter." The Queen studied him for a long moment, and her silver eyes seemed sad. "You humans live such brief lives," she said. 80 years if you are lucky, and most of that time is spent working and struggling and fighting, and then you are gone. That is just how it is." Marcus said, "We make the most of what we have. And yet, knowing how short your time is, you still risked everything to save my daughter," the Queen said. "A creature who will live for thousands of years was protected by one who might only have decades left, and you did not even think twice about it." Marcus looked down at Lyrae, who was playing with the buttons on his shirt. "She was scared," he said again. "It did not matter how long either of us would live, because in that moment she needed help, and I could give it." The Queen leaned forward, and her glow brightened. "That is exactly why I've brought you here," she said, "because among my people there exists an ancient bond called Veltherin, and it is a life debt so profound that it transcends politics and species and time itself." Marcus felt confused because he did not know what she was talking about. Veltherin has not been invoked for a non-Althari in 12,000 years, the Queen continued. "But what you did for my daughter meets every requirement of the ancient laws, and I would be dishonoring those laws if I did not offer it to you." "I do not understand," Marcus said. "What exactly are you offering?" The Queen smiled, and it transformed her face from something terrifying into something warm and almost motherly. "I am offering you adoption into the royal house of Althari," she said. "You would become a brother of the blood and a prince of our empire, and Lyrae would become your sister-in-law and spirit." Marcus stared at her in shock because this was not what he had expected at all. "You would be granted our longevity treatments," the Queen continued, "which would extend your lifespan to match ours, and you would have centuries of life instead of decades, and you would never be alone." Again, Lyrae looked up at Marcus, with hope shining in her silver eyes, and she said something in her language that he did not understand, but the meaning was clear. She wanted him to stay. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, and his voice was shaking now. "I am just a soldier, and I have killed people, and I have done terrible things, and I am not worthy of this kind of honor." The Queen reached out and took his hand in hers. "You carried my daughter through hell," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "You held her above the water when your body was failing, and you asked for nothing, and expected nothing, and you would have died for her without a second thought." She squeezed his hand, and Marcus saw tears forming in her ancient silver eyes. "My people have forgotten what that kind of love looks like," she said. "We calculate and plan and weigh costs and benefits, and we have lost the ability to simply act because it is right." She looked at him with something like wonder in her expression. "You reminded us what we used to be, Sergeant Cole, and for that gift, I would give you everything in my power to give." Marcus felt something breaking open inside his chest, and it was a feeling he had not experienced since he was a child, and it took him a moment to recognize what it was. It was hope. "I do not know how to be a prince," he said. "I only know how to be a soldier." "Then you will learn," the Queen said, "and we will teach you, and Lyrae will help you, and you will have all the time in the universe to figure it out." She stood and offered him her hand. "What do you say, Sergeant Marcus Cole?" she asked. "Will you accept this fate beyond reward and become part of our family?" Marcus looked at Lyrae, who was holding her breath and waiting for his answer, and he looked at the Queen, who was offering him everything he had never known he wanted, and he thought about his empty apartment back on Earth and his lonely life and his slow march toward a meaningless death. Then he thought about holding Lyrae in that dark tunnel and feeling like he mattered for the first time in years. "Yes," he said, and his voice was steady now. "I accept." Lyrae squealed with joy and threw her arms around his neck, and the Queen smiled with tears running down her glowing cheeks, and Marcus felt something he had never felt before. He felt like he had finally come home. 50 years passed like water flowing through fingers. Marcus stood on the balcony of his chambers in the Crystal Palace and watched the twin suns of the throne world set behind the mountains, and he still could not believe this was his life. He looked the same as he had on that day in the throne room because the longevity treatments had stopped his aging, and he would look this way for centuries to come. The war had ended 20 years ago, and Marcus had played a part in that ending because he had become something no one expected. He had become a symbol. Story of the human soldier who saved the Elthari princess had spread across the galaxy, and it had changed the way people thought about humanity. For thousands of years, the older races had seen humans as children playing at civilization, and they had tolerated them and sometimes used them, but never respected them. But Marcus had shown them something they had forgotten, had shown them that humans could love without expecting anything in return and sacrifice without calculating the cost, and that their short lives made their choices more meaningful, not less. When the peace negotiations began, the Dominion had requested that Marcus be present because even the enemy had heard the stories and wanted to see the human prince for themselves. He had sat in those meetings and listened to ancient beings argue about borders and resources, and he had said very little. But his presence had reminded everyone why the war needed to end. After the treaty was signed, a Dominion general had approached him privately. "I do not understand you humans," the general had said. "You are weak and short-lived, and you have no natural weapons yet. You terrify me more than any species I have ever fought." "Why?" Marcus had asked. "Because you cannot be predicted," the general said. "A logical species would have left that child to die, but you did not, and that unpredictability makes you dangerous in ways I cannot calculate." Marcus had smiled at that because he knew the general was wrong. It was not unpredictability that made humans special. It was love. The door behind him opened and Lyrae stepped onto the balcony, and she was grown now and beautiful, and her skin glowed with the soft blue light he remembered from that first night in the ruins. She was no longer a frightened child, but a powerful diplomat who had spent her life building bridges between humans and Elthari, and she credited Marcus for everything she had become. "You are being melancholy again," she said, and she came to stand beside him at the railing. "I can always tell when you are thinking too much." "Just remembering," Marcus said. "It has been 50 years since you gave me that flower in the temple." Lyrae smiled and touched the small dried flower that Marcus still wore in the locket around his neck. "I cannot believe you kept it," she said. "It was the first gift anyone had given me in 20 years. Marcus said, "How could I not keep it?" They stood together in comfortable silence and watched the suns disappear below the horizon, and the stars began to appear one by one. "The human ambassador is arriving tomorrow," Lyrae said. "She wants to discuss expanding the cultural exchange program." "I know," Marcus said. "I helped design the program, remember?" "She also wants to meet you personally," Lyrae said. "Apparently, you are quite famous among your own people now." Marcus laughed softly because that still felt strange to him. On Earth, they told stories about the orphan soldier who became an alien prince, and children grew up dreaming of being like him, and he had become proof that humanity had a place among the stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyrae asked suddenly. leaving your own kind and staying here with us. Marcus looked at her and saw the child she had been hidden inside the woman she had become, and he felt the same protective love he had felt on that first night when he pulled her from the rubble. I did not leave anything, he said. I finally found where I belonged. Lyra leaned her head against his shoulder, and her glow brightened with happiness. I am glad you stayed, Marcus, she said, and she still pronounced his name wrong after all these years, and he hoped she would never stop. I am glad too, he said below them. The Crystal City began to light up as night fell, and millions of Elthuri went about their lives unaware that their entire civilization had been changed by one human soldier who refused to leave a scared child behind. Marcus thought about the man. He'd been 50 years ago, and he barely recognized him. The man had been empty and alone and waiting to die, and he had carried nothing but weapons and regret now. He had a family and a purpose and centuries of life stretching out before him, and he had a sister who loved him and a mother who had given him everything, and a people who had accepted him as one of their own, all because he had made one simple choice in the ruins of a burning city. He had chosen to help. That was the secret that older races had forgotten, and that was what humanity brought to the galaxy. Not technology or military might or political cunning, just the simple, stubborn refusal to leave someone behind when they needed help. Marcus smiled and put his arm around Lyra, and together they watched the stars come out over their home. He had carried a scared child through hell, expecting nothing, and the universe had given him everything he never knew he needed: purpose and family in time enough to matter, and that was more than enough. That was everything.